So you know how some people have a favorite pen with a specific brand, model, and color, line thickness? Well, I have taken that to the next extreme. I really like pens, and I spend way too much time thinking about them. One thing I've learned after spending so much time in this penverse is that a lot of good pens are Japanese. This is because our languages require different things from our pens. In the West, we use our Greco-Roman, but with Japanese, with all the intricate characters, it's a lot easier to write if you have a very fine tip. Because of this difference in language, a lot of Japanese pens are more precise and more specialized than their Western counterparts. This means that the average pen that a Japanese person has is probably nicer than the average pen an American has. This difference starts in the office store, but extends to all other facets of life, including media. So with that being said, let's talk about some stationery found in anime. So if you've ever seen an anime set in a high school, you've definitely seen the Kokuyo Campus Notebook. The Kokuyo Campus Notebook is a very versatile notebook. You can get it lined, dotted line, graph, or in blank. This means that it's very useful for students as well as artists, as well as writers, as well as physicists, as well as whoever wants to use it. The paper quality is also really high, especially considering how low the cost is. The paper will hold up to markers, fountain pens, and therefore will hold up to mechanical pencils and erasers just with no problem. I mostly used my campus notebook for my math class, which is why I only got about halfway through it, but it held up to the constant abuse that I put it through. In that notebook, I mostly wrote with a pilot friction pen, and to erase that pen, you need to apply a lot of pressure with a hard rubber eraser. Over my semester, I never had an issue with tearing of the page. It held up constantly. So overall, the Kokuyo Campus is a solid, versatile choice, and I'd give it a 7 out of 10. Now that we know what notebooks are super prevalent in anime, let's talk about some pencils. So the issue with pencils is that a lot of them look very similar. To tell the difference between them, you need to see some very intricate details, which it's not always possible to do in anime. However, I have a couple of pencils here that could probably represent most of the pencils you'll see in an anime. So let's talk about the Uniball Kuretoga. The Uniball Kuretoga is a really interesting pencil. So you know how when you're writing with a mechanical pencil and the lead flattens down on one side, so you have to turn it in your hand and then it'll flatten down on that side? The Uniball Kuretoga was designed with this specific problem in mind. So what they did is every time you lift the pen off the paper, the lead twists within the barrel, which means that the pencil's thickness stays constant always, and you never have a sharp edge and a dull end on your pencil lid. This is so much fun to write with. It's amazing. It feels so cool. I kind of feel like a wizard writing with it, Like it's just such a cool little mechanism. Far and away, I really enjoy this mechanic of the pencil. However, the only drawback is that in order to do that, there is some give when you push down on the page. You can feel the mechanism being activated. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's not too bad in the grand scheme of things. As far as the rest of the pencil goes, it's pretty good. I mean, the design of the barrel is pretty good. There's nothing super special or iconic about it. The eraser is fine. There's nothing special about it. It's just an eraser. The clip design is actually really good. It's a really solid clip choice. It doesn't really break and it holds on to stuff really well. You can really tell that the priority of the Kuretoga is in fact the twisting mechanism, and that's totally fine. It is such a cool and unique feature that it makes the Uniball Kuretoga a fantastic pencil to write with. I'd say it's a 7 out of 10. In contrast to the flashy Kuretoga, there doesn't seem to be anything too terribly special about the Pentel graph gear. However, this initial thought is misleading. On the outside, the graph gear is just a normal pencil. There's nothing special about it. However, its strength comes in the execution. The graph gear is a little bit shorter than the Kuretoga, and there is a lot more weight in the grip. This means that the balance is pushed way towards the tip, and it's so much better to hold. Whereas with the Kuretoga, it looks good and it has some cool features. The graph gear feels like it was designed to fit into your hand. This means that it's a lot easier to use over long periods of time, and it's generally just easier to hold. Despite the boring-ish design, the Pentel graph gear is a fantastic pencil, and I'd give it a 7 out of 10. The final pencil I want to talk about is the Bic Matic Grip. Now, the Kuretoga is a great pencil, and so is the Pentel graph gear, but the Bic Matic Grip, well, it doesn't exactly live up to the hype. The Matic Grip is entirely made out of plastic, whereas the Kuretoga and the Pentel graph gear are at least partially made out of metal. This makes the Matic Grip feel so much cheaper than the other two pencils, and overall it just feels kind of flimsy. If I grab it too hard, I can see it bend, and this does not inspire much confidence in me. Also, the extension mechanism of the Matic Grip is pretty bad. Whenever you try to erase, it twists and makes a clicking sound, and it's just so aggravating. The only other mechanical pencils that twist and click like this are other Bics, so come on, get it together, Bic. The eraser's terrible, the clip's terrible, the barrel is just horrendous, so overall, I can't give it anything higher than a 7 out of 10. Alright, real quick before we move on from pencils, I just want to mention that Ritsu has a Lamy Safari mechanical pencil, and I don't know why. There's no reason for her to have this. I thought she was poor. What's going on? Alright, so we've already talked about pencils. Let's talk about their counterpart, the eraser. There are a couple different kinds of erasers, but if we're talking about erasers in anime, we've got to talk about the Tombow Mono. The Tombow Mono is, simply put, iconic. The black, white, and blue stripes on the paper covering look amazing, and I'm sure this eraser has at least started one relationship somewhere. The mono eraser is so prevalent because it's just an amazing eraser. When you erase, there's not a lot of dust because it all clumps up together. This makes it super easy to brush away and also clean up later. The erasing quality is fantastic too. It almost doesn't matter how hard you were drawing, the Tombow Mono will clean it right up. It also takes way less pressure than I was expecting, so erasing, it doesn't even require any work. All you have to do is give it a couple of passes and it's done its job. This eraser is perfect. I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10. Just to compare this eraser to another one, let's talk about the Pentel HI-POLYMER eraser. The HI-POLYMER doesn't erase quite as well as the mono, but that's because of one key difference between these two. The mono eraser is a lot less efficient. The HI-POLYMER will preserve its corners and edges for far longer and will also last longer than the mono. This is because the HI-POLYMER requires more effort into the page and the mono just withers away with a single touch. This makes the HI-POLYMER far more efficient than the mono. I could probably use 2 monos in the time it takes me to use 1 HI-POLYMER, and the HI-POLYMER is about half the size. So taking all this into account, I'd have to give both of these a solid 7 out of 10. So the stationery we've talked about so far has been pretty student oriented. The most popular use case for most of these products is in fact in school. So let's talk about some stuff for artists. If you've ever seen a manga anime, you've probably seen this exact pen. This is the Tachikawa comic pen with the Nikko G-Nib. Comic pens are really interesting because with most fountain pens, if you press down too firmly on the page, the tines will spread outwards and the pen breaks. At that point, it's no longer useful. However, with comic pens, the whole point is that when you press down on the page, the tines split and you get a better line width. Then when you lift your pen back up, it goes back to normal so you can draw thin lines again. This is super useful for drawing because in one pen stroke, without even taking the pen up, you can get thick lines and thin lines and medium lines and anything you want out of this one pen. This is especially interesting because most fountain pens that can actually bend like this are called flex pens and they can get really expensive really quickly. However, this handle nib combo was under 10 bucks and it works just as well, if not better than any flex pen. Another thing that makes the comic pen unique is that it's super modular, even more than a regular fountain pen. There are literally 2 parts to this pen, the handle and the nib. This means that I can use almost any given handle with any given nib, with any given ink. I can do whatever the heck I want to do. And this is a lot of fun. Most of the stuff I did was with my thickest ink, which is Noodler's X-Feather, but I also did some other colored inks, which was pretty interesting and a lot of fun, actually. I tried to do some calligraphy, but since I don't know how to write cursive, that didn't turn out so well. I also tried to do some drawing, and I found that the quality of art is directly proportional to the level of plagiarism. As far as the actual usage of the pen goes, it would get a little bit scratchy when the tines were spread, and I found that I needed to break it in a little bit, but overall, it was pretty good. I've never used a flex pen before, and it was actually really intuitive. It didn't take me that long to figure out how to use it, although I still haven't really gotten good at using it. The 2-part construction of this pen makes it super easy to clean and maintain. There's nothing to it. Just pop the nib out, rinse it out with water, and you're all set. All things considered, I think I'd have to give this pen a 7 out of 10. So one thing about comic pens is that they put down a lot of ink, even more than a broad fountain pen. This can make it really dangerous to write with because if you accidentally use it on a low quality paper, it'll bleed and feather like nobody's business and whatever you create will be totally unusable. Because of this, I also had to get some comic paper for my comic pen. I chose the Deleter comic book paper. and it's pretty good actually. The comic book paper is really thick. It feels more like a cardstock and less than like a regular printer paper, but that's kind of the point, so whatever. The comic paper also comes with a scale on the sides and top, and this I can assume would be really useful for drawing and scaling, but I just traced everything because I can't draw. I assume it's useful, but it's not useful for me, so I don't know. I did have two issues with the comic book paper. I would see some bleeding and I would see some tearing as well. And that's a problem. The explicit reason I'm using this paper is so that it doesn't do that. However, I don't know if this is a case of the paper not being good enough or me being too mean to the paper. It's very possible that I was pushing too hard on the page to try to get the tines to spread for the pen, and this is probably what caused the tearing. I don't think it's actually that big of a deal. I think it's actually my fault. This is the same for the bleeding as well. The ink I was using actually is optimized for fountain pens and not comic pens, so there could be some differences in thickness that probably affect its bleeding. I just kind of used what I had, but I mean, I don't know. That's how the paper turned out. The comic book paper does pass the smoothness test though. This is one thing that I like to do that I don't know if anybody else likes to do. I just kind of rub the paper on my face, and if it feels good, it's a good paper. Um, I mean, it's worked for me so far. So keeping in mind that the tearing and bleeding could very well be my own fault, I think I'd have to give the comic book paper a 7 out of 10. So yeah, that's everything I've got. I don't know why you would be still watching at this point, but anyway,